Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities.
Hi, Sbu. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you, Sia. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. So what do you have for us in store for this week from South Africa?
On when was it? On Tuesday, we had Freedom Day in South Africa. It was on the 27th of April that the country commemorated Freedom Day, which marks 27 years since the first democratic elections, which ushered in a new dispensation. Some were very optimistic about the strides made by the government. Basically, the government concentrated on education, housing, social services, and health. But on the other hand, many still living in poverty and relying on public amenities bemoan poor services. They are saying that there is nothing to celebrate.
Oh, that's quite sad.
Yep.
And despite the 27 years of democracy, South Africa still remains very racially divided. Why do you think there's been little progress in terms of the spatial and economic legacy of apartheid?
Well, my view is that the ruling party, which did most of the negotiations leading to and up to the current dispensation, got carried away with the legislative part of breaking down the apartheid system. They neglected economic reform. There was also an overcompensation during the negotiations. Too much was given away, I think. The land question, for example, was an issue that was never resolved. Like property rights were retained by those who were advantaged, who benefited from the British colonialism and apartheid. The thinking back then was that the new government were going to buy out landowners through a system of a model called willing buyer, willing seller. This, of course, didn't work out as there were many competing demands on the fiscus. So instead of concentrating on the productive side of the economy, the budget in the most part went to building non-existent and poor social services for the majority blacks.
So, and I think I'd like to add that the way in which welfare or public welfare has been provided in the post-apartheid period has also not been enabling people to empower themselves. I think mainly because of the small quantum of support, but also the fact that this support was provided as a no obligations grant as long as people met specific criteria. As a result, you get people not trying to meet the criteria in order to access the grants rather than using the grant system to enable themselves to be self-sufficient. And I think for me, that's precisely a design issue. And obviously, what you mentioned
Exactly.
about the land is crucial in terms of
Yeah.
the transformation of the spatial legacy of apartheid.
Mhm,
Without
mhm.
without concerted efforts to create more integrated society, we're not really going to see any changes in that legacy. And as you rightfully mentioned, the way in which the land question has been dealt with has not been adequate enough to transform the pattern of land ownership in the country. Despite some saying that even the attempts to amend the constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation is not necessary, given that the current constitution allows for this, and that it's actually the political will that's lacking on the part of politicians who came up with a principle that's not necessarily required by the law in the willing buyer, willing seller principle, which places the onus on the state. It would have been
Exactly.
interesting to see if South Africa had its own kind of Nuremberg trials, as it were, where we would have seen,
Uh-huh.
because the TRC was a very, very poor attempt at something similar in order to get justice, but even that was not able to, to change much in terms of the economic and social legacy of the country.
Exactly. What has happened and what ended up happening is that the perpetuation of the old spatial development patterns, there was a perpetuation of that. Because you were talking just now about land reform. Yeah, in most cases, we think that land reform is deals only with farmland, but it is much more than that because
Precisely.
in urban centers, which where the land belonged to the minority white landowners, the land there was exorbitant. It was very expensive, and the government couldn't buy the same land. The same even state land hasn't been apportioned to the people. So it makes it difficult for social housing to be built because social housing is not built in the city centers. It is built in the far-flung black townships, many kilometers away from
Yeah,
economic activity. Yeah, which
precisely.
makes life very expensive
And I've
for the.
always said that, this notion that land reform deals with rural land is a farce. We
It
weren't,
is.
as Black South Africans, we weren't forced away from rural areas and into townships. We were actually forced away from suburbia, which is current suburban South Africa, and into
Yes.
townships, areas such as District 6, which are now, bustling areas and suburban areas such as
Uh-huh.
Gardens and Zona Bloom, which were all part of the District 6 area, is where people
Yes.
land reform and restitution needs to take place, which makes, I think, the fight of the state even more difficult in that if you are going to expropriate land that is the most valuable land and you are going to get a ramification from that, you might end up on sanctions list, as many have threatened that South Africa might follow in the footsteps of Zimbabwe if they do pursue a land reform program that includes expropriation. But I still believe that South Africa is in a very different position than Zimbabwe was in. And I
Uh-huh.
don't think that if we are also to follow the letter of the law, that there would be a similar type of response on the part of our international development partners and the powers that be, so to speak. But I think that
Exactly.
with all of this, what's at the core is that we cannot have any kind of capital accumulation or wealth accumulation without land. It doesn't matter how many jobs you earn or how much income you might earn on a regular basis in terms of current income. You're not going to accumulate any wealth if it's not built on the accumulation of fixed capital, such as land, which is very, very fundamental in the transformation process, at least of the economic and social legacies of apartheid, and the way in which we had implemented programs of housing, for example, the RDP program, as I think of one, was also
Hmm.
very poorly implemented. The housing was substandard, and as you say, it was in far-flung township areas, which are very far from the actual economic activity that takes place. I mean, I've heard
Yeah.
statistics such as uh, an average of around 30 to 45% of Cape Town Metro Rail users are actual job seekers who are illegally staff riding on trains in order to find jobs in towns and where the economic activity is taking place. So I think
Mm.
unless the South African government is able to solve the dilemma of land restitution in suburban or urban areas, we're not going to see any changes in terms of the racial and economic legacy of apartheid.
That's it. Yeah, precisely, precisely. Let me get on to the next story from South Africa. On Wednesday, the 28th of April, the ANC president appeared before the State Capture Commission. President Cyril Ramaphosa appeared before the Zondo Commission in his capacity as president of the ANC, the ruling party. In his statement, he mentioned that the ANC, I quote, the ANC distances itself from those in its ranks who were complicit in state capture. And he also said, open quote, the era of state capture is relegated to history, close quote. The president also tried to explain the controversial issue of cadre deployment, which he said his party used to exercise power in the interests of the people. Yep, the State Capture Commission continues.
Yeah.
Our next story here is on the Minister of Public Service is asking the public for solutions to a deadlocked wage negotiations process. The public sector unions and government negotiators failed to reach a compromise as the employer insisted on a 0% cost of living adjustment while unions maintained their 7% demand, which is CPIX plus 4%. In a strange turn of events, Public Service and Administration Minister Mr. Senzo Mchunu described this year's negotiations as the most difficult ever. The minister also urged the nation to forward proposals to the government to assist in resolving the deadlocked public service wage negotiations.
Has
I
the
we,
government given any reasons for this proposed 0% increase or public sector salary freeze?
yeah, we ran the story even last week. This is a continuation of that. To answer your question, the government says there is no room for expanding state finances, meaning that South Africa has hit a fiscal cliff. You will remember that the South African government, the debt accounted for 77.1% of the country's nominal GDP in December 2020. South Africa's debt levels are very high. They surged during 2020 while the economy contracted by 7% in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has vowed to avert a looming fiscal debt crisis. The first point of call is cutting the wage bill. In the medium term, it is estimated that 300 billion rands can be saved if there is a freeze on government employee salaries. So
But isn't that
he's
confusing to me? Because on the one end, for example, we were borrowing money internationally in dollars when it wasn't necessary to finance our response to COVID-19, because it wasn't necessary because we had a current account surplus, so we weren't facing any balance of payments problems. In addition to
yes,
the money that we wanted to borrow was towards spending on social grants, right? The 350
uh-huh,
social relief grant, which we spoke about last
yes,
week as well. But
uh-huh,
why then did we rush to go and borrow from international markets when we could have borrowed locally? For example, we issued a 200 billion loan guarantee scheme, of which we haven't even touched a quarter or a tenth of in terms of the lending that should have taken place, when government could have actually financed the fiscus using the same mechanism. If, for instance, we're going to say there was little appetite on the part of local banks or local finance institutions. This is this is concerning to me that on the one hand we're cutting so-called costs on the fiscus, such as wages, but on the other end we're taking very poor fiscal decisions, such as borrowing in dollars in order to spend on social grants. Can you balance me on this one, sir?
It, uh, it's very interesting. Some like me are saying that even that act of going to the IMF and borrowing about 4 billion in US dollars, as you said, we did not need that money. As you don't need uh, a debt in foreign currency because
Exactly.
as you know, the South African rand has been depreciating by about 20% in the past 5 years. See, it has depreciated by about 20%. So even if the IMF gives you a loan at 1% interest,
You're still going to
your
pay
real cost,
depreciation.
your exactly. Your real cost is the depreciation on your currency.
Plus
Um,
interest. Yeah.
so, some are saying that this is some kind of like a Margaret Thatcher ploy, um, in order to bring down the wage bill, in order to bring down our debt to G- GDP ratios, because they are so obsessed with this less than 80% debt to the GDP. So my view is that you should not you should not be so obsessed with mm, these self-imposed restrictions like a certain percentage as a ceiling for your debt. Even if our debt went up to about 89%, up to 100%, it really is not that serious, in my view. Anyway,
Sure. Look,
I think it's
I've got my own reasons. So for me, firstly, is this a good policy decision? Right. That's the starting point. We're in a
yeah,
recession. We're dealing with a pandemic. Is it the right decision to go through fiscal consolidation? No. You know,
no,
as a Keynesian, as any kind of economist, 101 will tell you, in a recession, you need government spending in order to push up aggregate demand and resuscitate the economy. That's the first.
exactly.
Second point is, if you are going to obsess yourself about immaterial ratios, such as debt to GDP, which has got nothing really to do rather than being a sort of robot indicator in terms of green, red, and amber regarding your debt,
Yes.
you have two ways to resolve that. A, you can reduce your spending, but if you're still borrowing, you're not actually going to be reducing much because you're borrowing also in dollars and increasing the debt quantum. At the same time, your economy is not growing, which is the other way which you
Uh-huh.
can reduce the ratio is by growing your economy. So if we're not taking the
Definitely.
right policy decision to start off with, we're not going in the right direction in terms of reducing the debt in any case. And then on top of it, we're
Mhm.
going to make poor borrowing decisions in order to tie the hands of policymakers in policies that we can now blame on the IMF as a requirement. When in fact, the IMF and its own ideology is questioning the whole theory and foundation of fiscal consolidation as a standard way of resolving fiscal crises. Because what really matters isn't necessarily how much debt you're accruing, but what you're actually spending that money you're borrowing on. And in South Africa, we've been spending quite considerably on infrastructure investment from the public sector side. And that infrastructure investment hasn't been able to attract private capital investment because that has always been lagging and been far less in extent compared to public debt. But this is changing, obviously, as we've mentioned, that we're now borrowing in order to spend on social welfare programs, which to me do not create the economic returns to justify a foreign currency borrowing. And so
Yeah.
it seems as though we're saying the one thing in terms of the rhetoric of policymaking in South Africa and doing another in terms of our actual actions and whether or not we are resuscitating the economy in order to reduce GDP or debt burden on the economy, or taking the right policy decision given where we are in the business cycle, we're missing the boat completely. But in any case, let's
Precisely.
move on.
Yeah, our last story is still on economics. Finance Minister has confirmed that real GDP growth has been stagnant since 2007.
So that's
South
something.
Africa's
That's news. Then
yeah, South Africa's real GDP growth stopped growing 14 years ago, according to Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Real GDP growth is a measurement used to compare improved production and the rising standard of living between countries over time. Other emerging markets have more than doubled per capita income over the past 2 decades. Meanwhile, the income per capita in South Africa has declined to 6,001 US dollars per capita in 2019. Way back in 2007, our per capita was 6,096 rand. US dollars, according to the World Bank data. South Africa's decline is a reflection of endemic low economic growth combined with relatively rapid population growth. Yeah.
and again, this is the news. We've been told this over and over again. If it wasn't the OECD, it was the World Bank. If it wasn't, it was IMF. The fact that our population growth is around 1%, meanwhile, growth in the economy has been less than 1%. And as you've
Uh-huh.
indicated here clearly, if GDP per capita over a period of, what was that, over 10, 15 years,
14 years.
declines from $7,000 per capita to about $6,000 is very, very concerning. And that means that not only have we been growing slowly, in fact, we've destroyed some wealth in the process.
Exactly.
So my question to you is, beyond this, we have to acknowledge what are the root causes of the slow growth. So in your view, what is the root cause of the slow growth from your perspective?
We touched on it in the previous stories here, but what I would like to stress is that South Africa has a small middle income class. Your so-called what do they call them? What did they call them earlier? They were called BEE, black diamonds.
Black diamonds,
Black
yes.
diamonds, yes. That class is relatively small compared to the size of the population. And there has been an investment strike, not only by the private sector. Last week, you talked about the private sector being in an investment strike. I agree with that because about an estimated 1.5 trillion rand is hoarded by the private sector. But on top of that, the government is also on an investment strike. Investment in capital goods has ground to a trickle since 2014. Growth in the economy has been stimulated for the most part by state investment. As in, you would remember back in the Thabo Mbeki years, between 2003 and 2007, there was phenomenal growth where more than a million jobs were created. Now, the private sector piggybacked on that, and our South African private sector, which caters for a small percentage of the population, has never led any investment drive. They only follow and pick up profits derived from government investment. So that's where it all lies. There is no synergy between public and private investment. In fact, there is also no private sector led investment drive. Our current president and the current administration has always been talking up this private sector-led growth. I wonder, I don't think it will ever come for the reasons I've already stated. Yeah.
Yeah, and it does seem that we're stuck in an egg and chicken situation because some would argue that given the low demand in South Africa, there's no incentive for private capital to invest, right? But I would say
Yes.
the low demand in South Africa is largely the result of the economic legacy of apartheid, in that we haven't been able to resolve the concentration of capital and economic power in the minority in terms of the population, and
Hmm.
we're still carrying a huge majority population that's poor and dependent on social welfare and benevolence of the state, really, in terms of
Yes.
what they will, put on their tables. And I would say that unless we're actually going to get the right type of policy to transform the economy and the direction of wealth in the country, we're not going to resolve the demand question. Fine. So then others would argue that maybe we need more public investment in order to attract private investment, building of roads, connecting people through telecommunications infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure. But we've seen that in fact, what we consider the lost decade under former President Jacob Zuma was actually a decade of heavy public investment. Yes, some of that did end
Yes.
up in the private pockets of, state capturers, but in the end of the day, we saw very, very high levels of public investment. Upwards of 15% of GDP was public capital investment. Hence, we've accumulated quite a considerable amount of debt during that process. But we still haven't realized much of this. Yes, it has changed and transformed the location of capital on the country, as we've seen the rise of provinces such as KZN rivaling, the secondary provinces such as the Western Cape, because Gauteng will continue to be number one in terms of the wealth generation and the economic activity on the country. But we've seen that apart from just those shifts in terms of the provinces competing with one another, we haven't necessarily realized it on an aggregate basis in terms of economic activity because, as you've said, there's been an investment strike. There's also expatriation of capital moving out of the country and being invested in the rest of the world, despite the good returns that still do exist in the country. And really, for me, I don't know if there's a policy response to this very deep political problem. And I think it's not going to be a one-off solution that government is going to create the policy to attract private capital to invest without actually creating a wealth base amongst the majority black population, and then you will start seeing the investment because we've seen the investment that follows, for example, the welfare, and how, for example, huge retail chains such as ShopRite have attached themselves to the whole lifestyle of welfare grant system, so much so that you can actually extract your grants from them. And we've seen the state working much more closely with these retail outlets than actually distributing the grants themselves. And unless we can create a wealth base amongst the black majority population, there's unlikely to be investment. And that's why our private capital has been invested in the rest of the continent, which have also been growing at much faster rate than South Africa has been growing, precisely because they seem to be getting it right in terms of creating domestic wealth in the rest of the continent than we are doing so in South Africa. Very, very, very
I,
concerned.
yeah, I think in our next episode we will touch on the extreme financialization of the South African economy, wherein
Definitely. That's a topic we need to cover. We need to cover
exactly
because it's led
you
precisely
ask a pertinent question:
to the
who
benefits you
benefits
mentioned.
from the investment?
Exactly.
Yeah,
And the beneficiaries
because the
have
fund.
been your retail outlets who have suffered under COVID because of the low demand and the restrictions, as well as the financial sector. which seems to have carried
Exactly.
on unabated despite the pandemic
Exactly.
and despite the crisis. But I guess that's a
Exactly.
story for another day. And I think
Yep.
that's
Yes. Yeah.
from South Africa for this week.
Yes. That's it. That's it. Yeah.
On that note, let me take us through the happenings in the rest of Africa for this week.
Yep.
The UN Security Council has raised concerns about the situation in Somalia again. The UN Security Council expressed deep concern about the continuing political impasse and disagreement amongst Somalia's political leaders on the model for elections. This disagreement over the electoral model is not only undoing the hard earned progress, but is also diverting attention from pressing problems such as flood, drought, desert locusts, and the COVID-19 pandemic, and combating of terrorism threats such as Al-Shabaab in the region.
I read up on about the Somali clan system some time ago, which is linked to traditional ways of governance. I wonder whether the clan leaders have got anything to do with this disagreement. But then it is a topic that we will surely touch in our next episodes, because this Somali problem is not getting resolved. Yeah.
Not at all. And so, how does it work, the tribal-based electoral system? Can you give us a flavor of how that operates?
Basically, it's some sort of a federal system wherein clans get a designated number of seats, depending on how big the clan is, its proximity to power, how far it is from the center, the capital, and all of that. It's a complicated system. I think we will, like I said, discuss it further in our next installment. Yeah.
No problem. The East
Yes.
African community now is proposing a political confederation to strengthen regional integration in East Africa. In May 2017, the East African Community Heads of States adopted a political confederation as a transitional model to the political federation and appointed a team of experts to draft a model constitution for the proposed confederation. Under a confederal system, some kind of central authority would be put in place to guide policies and activities in East African member states. And the political federation is the ultimate pillar in the East African integration process, which will be preceded by a customs union, a common market, and a monetary union uh, as they follow a process of deepening integration for the future. And
S-
go ahead, sir.
Okay. Now, I was just going to ask you about this political confederation. Can you please expand on it, how differently it is from the European Union model and things like that?
All right. So the European Union model is still, so as we are now, we have a monetary union in the European Union, right? So it's a common
Uh-huh.
currency. They've sacrificed individual member states' monetary policy in favor of a regional monetary policy. So we're one
Mm.
step away from a customs union, right? And a common
Yeah.
market. So from a customs union, what that does is you reduce the tariffs of member states to zero, and you only charge tariffs on goods from outside the union, right? So think of the Southern
Uh-huh.
African Customs Union between Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, and Eswatini. Those countries trade freely with one another and at the same time
Uh-huh.
charge a common external tariff to parties from outside. Then you can advance further and say you want to create a common market. So the common market now is a further reduction in not just the movement of goods, but the movement of capital as well as humans. So, for example, you must have heard of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is creating
Yes,
a
yes.
common market across the continent. So, there, what they're trying to do is move further into deepening integration by not only reducing the restriction on the movement of goods, but also the movement of people as well as capital. And ultimately, you get a monetary union, which is where the European Union currently is now. Where the East African community wants to go is a step further to say we're not only integrating from economics point of view, so the monetary union now is a single currency. And as I said, you no longer have monetary policy in order to adjust to national differences and external shocks, but you have a regional policy. In terms of interest rates, you will have rates that are set centrally for all the countries rather than each country setting its own interest rate. We already have something similar if you consider SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, or at least for the
Yeah.
members who are part of the Common Monetary Area, which is Lesotho, Namibia, Eswatini, and South Africa, where all of these countries accept rand as a as for transactions, but South Africa doesn't accept the Namibian dollar, Eswatini, Lilangeni, as well as the Maluti, the Lesotho Loti, but
Yes.
compensates those countries for seniorage losses by accepting rand. And what that means that these countries are also tied. They cannot set interest rates which are significantly lower than the South African interest rate because the Common Monetary Agreement binds them to ensuring that they maintain a policy that is at least as liberal as the South African monetary policy. If we were creating a complete monetary union, there would be a single
Mhm.
rate in terms of the interest rate for the whole region. So obviously you can understand that because there are differences amongst countries and countries are at different areas of the business cycle at different times, you do want to have that differentiation. And so how they normally do it is that um, when you move towards a monetary union, they also pool all their reserves in terms of foreign exchange reserves in order to allow members to draw on a collective pool of revenues rather than dealing with external shocks as individual countries. Because now countries cannot implement monetary policy on their own to respond to those external shocks. So, for example, when the oil price collapses, and
Uh-huh.
countries like Nigeria or Angola aren't earning enough from their oil exports, they would normally depreciate their currency, right? In order to adjust
Yeah.
the demand so that they don't deplete their foreign exchange reserves. Now, because you're in a monetary union, you can't just decide to depreciate your currency. And so this is where the sharing of reserves becomes in critical importance. Now, moving a step further now is that we're not just running a single currency, we're now running a single sort of state, right? In that there is now
Yes. Yes.
supranational political body that precedes the national parties within a country or the national government within a country. So that is the step at which the East African Union is working towards or trying to draft a constitution for. And initially, it will be a political confederation, meaning that each country still acts as a sovereign state. However, effectively in the future, they want to reach a stage where the East African community is a sort of United States of East Africa, if you were. So, for example, if you think of the states in the United States of America, they will still have federal legislation and federal laws, but will still have state laws and state freedoms, but those are limited. So, this means that there will be a single currency in the East African community member states. There would be a monetary union established by default before you reach the political federation. And so that
I,
really is the difference. It's more about the extent of the integration. That is what differentiates where the European Union is at versus where the East African community wants to go. But I think at this point it is still ambitious, given that they've still not even established a monetary union as yet. And even the monetary union phase in itself is a phase that is almost indefinite. If you think of the
mm,
Southern African Customs Union as a monetary union, that was
uh-huh.
established in 1910. It is the oldest customs union. And
Oh,
even there, among four member states, five
yes.
member states, you still have one, Botswana, who is not part of the monetary union. So there are these tensions because countries are never willing to completely sacrifice their monetary policy because they face external shocks. And if you add the
Yes.
further risk that African countries face in that we export commodities, we need that lever of monetary policy in order to adjust to commodity price shocks.
So, Sia, you're talking about sovereignty, they retain sovereignty. But now, my question would be, the European Union has these trade agreements wherein they go in as a bloc. What what will happen with trade and investment agreements to these East African community member states as they pursue this goal?
So they will eventually become one, right? So by the time,
Uh-huh.
for instance, you establish a common market, you're now harmonizing in terms of your customs procedure. All the goods close to zero in terms of the free trade area requirements. So 85% of the tariff lines must be reduced to zero. And then on top of it, you are establishing a common market in terms of the customs procedure and clearance of goods, as well as
Uh-huh.
the movement of people. So people no longer need a passport. And in East Africa, you can move amongst the countries just using your ID, even if you're Kenyan
Yes.
going to Tanzania, etc. So they've established a common market. Now, by the
Mm,
time they establish a monetary union, they already are starting to think as a bloc, right? Because they
I
would have
see.
a single currency. Think of it maybe as an East African shilling, as it were, because most
Uh-huh.
countries use shillings, and some are
Uh-huh.
using a franc system because of the French heritage. But the point is, at that point now, the countries need to think of themselves as unitary actors in terms of their monetary policy because the currency needs to be maintained by all who are member states. So
I
that
see.
at that point, that's when the trade treaties become one because as a monetary union, you only are dealing with external parties in terms of trade agreements because all the members in the union already have no tariffs amongst one another. So you already are trading freely. We already have people moving freely and capital moving freely amongst the countries. You not
Uh-huh.
actually are interested in dealing with each other as sovereigns rather than dealing with external parties as a bloc, as it were, as is the European case. But now, if they
Yes.
take a step further as a federation, that means now the laws that are set will be set in a sort of regional parliament. You must have heard of the Pan African Parliament, which is also
Uh-huh.
part of the continental process of integration, which will become increasingly important. It starts off as a body for making of trade rules, such as, for example, the European Commission, which
Yes.
most of it spends most of its time dealing with sanitary and phyto requirements and trade regulation generally. From that trade regulation and creating regulation that must be adopted by the region as a whole, you then develop into a single legislating body that sets the laws for the region rather than having national sovereign states which set their own laws, which are supposed to be harmonized with one another. You then are setting laws for the entire region. And the European Union hasn't reached that stage. The only kind of similar thing arrangement was under the USSR, the
Uh,
United Soviet Republic, Socialist
yeah.
Soviet Republic, before it became Russia and the other East Bloc states started gaining their own independence. And you can already see, I mean, even up to this day, some of those tensions haven't been resolved as certain people
Precisely.
feel that they should still retain the old arrangement, whilst other countries feel that their independence is actually more important.
Hmm.
So I think the
Very
East African
interesting.
community has quite a long way to go. I do
Yes.
think, though, that the current plans are still very ambitious and even to reach some of these milestones will still take them many more years.
Decades, maybe. Yes, yes, yeah.
Our next
Okay.
story is regarding Mozambique, as uh, Total declares force majeure on the Mozambique LNG project. So Total
Oh,
confirmed the withdrawal of all its Mozambique LNG project personnel from a Fungi site due to the security situation in north of Cabo Delgado. According to Total, this has led the company to declare force majeure. Declaring force majeure means that Total believes it cannot be held liable for any losses which contracted parties might sustain as a result of the termination or suspension of the project due to the security situation being beyond Total's control. However, there's still hope that Total might work with the government of Mozambique and other parties involved in order to find a solution to safely continue with the Mozambique LNG project.
in the initial stages, yeah, right at the beginning, whose responsibility was security? The government of Mozambique, I suppose, was responsible for security, but with political instability um, in Mozambique, with with the Renamo rebels um, doing their thing in the center of the country and towards the north, who weren't there any? Wasn't this political instability projected? One would have thought that Total would do their due diligence, and those reports would give them an indication of the strength of the Mozambican military. Um, what right at the beginning, whose responsibility was security really?
Sure. So there's a joint task force that is maintained by the government of Mozambique as well as Total. So Total provides money to the government of Mozambique to staff and create a joint task force staffed by the Defense Force of Mozambique, but as well as private contractors. At the last discussion we had earlier this month on Mozambique, they had put together a task force of around 1,400 military personnel. And this was a larger contingent than the number of staff members who were there on site, who were around
Uh-huh.
1,200. And that was the
Mm,
kind of arrangement that's been in place. That it's a collective arrangement where Total
uh-huh.
pays the government of Mozambique for security. I think obviously at the time when the concessions were being awarded and the time when the project was fundraising, all up until financial close, the conflict
Uh,
was not actually on the radar of financiers as well as Total, because the concessions were done at around the 2008 2009 period, and by the time the projects were reaching financial close in the period 2015 2016, the conflict hadn't risen to its prominent features or its prominent status as it has now, as that started in around 2017 and moving onwards. Uh, that was also led on by the fact that Renamo won in the provincial elections control over Cabo Delgado as a province, which made it more difficult then for the Frelimo government to actually have a control, let alone obviously the historical issues of it being far from the center and facing benign neglect from the government in the first place. So I think
uh-huh.
a lot of the security risk challenges have come as a surprise to some, but for people who know the history of Cabo Delgado and how it has been repeatedly used, not only as a source for former colonial powers from Portuguese as a way to destabilize Mozambique, but even neighboring countries in their own interest in pitting Renamo against Frelimo. You'll remember that when we discussed Mozambique earlier this month, we also touched
Yes.
on the historical issues such as Zimbabwean government, Zambian government, and even the former apartheid South African government meddling in the affairs in Mozambique by
mm,
financing Renamo in their fight against Frelimo. Obviously,
mm,
towards independence, Frelimo won the civil war and has been in power since, and also dealing with the challenge of having an armed opposition domestically. However, the process of disarmament and reintegration into the military has been very slow. And I think the presence of the terrorist fear and attack in North Cabo Delgado has created this contradiction in that Renamo members have been slow to disarm, mainly because they can see that the terrorist insurgency in northern Cabo Delgado is actually able to extract some rents and disrupt the government using its military force. And it was initially not even measured how much of a significant force existed in North Cabo Delgado. For some who thought that this would be a, pass, a passing wind,
yeah,
was surprised to realize how much of an internal displacement problem and a humanitarian crisis the whole
mm,
conflict has actually caused. And
mm,
hence, I think companies like Total are not only taking the security risk into account by calling on a force majeure, but also realizing the risk in terms of a reputational risk of being involved in that project whilst the insurgency problem remains unresolved. And so, really, the only way forward for Mozambique was to find support from SADC because they have
yes,
got very limited internal military capacity, and due to the fact that the conflict now was spreading into neighboring Tanzania and taking on a regional face, it was imperative that SADC countries get involved. And you might remember that last week we covered or 2 weeks ago, we covered the story of SADC deploying a technical team to find out
mhm,
what's happening in Cabo Delgado. And it
mm,
was going to then follow this investigation. SADC would make an agreement on to what military contingent or response they would do. But we've not seen any of that given where we are in the conflict and the fact that Total is now declared force majeure. But there's still some hope that working with the government of Mozambique, Total would be able to enable a safe environment in north of Cabo Delgado such that the project will continue. I have my doubts. However, given the quantums of money that were invested, you're talking about $60 billion that has been
ah,
invested within the LNG sector alone in Mozambique,
mm,
tells me that there's some significant interests, but I'm just not certain whether or not those interests will be big enough in order to deal with the terrorist threat decisively. Because I speculate that the only sort of solution that we could find in Cabo Delgado is a partial solution, which would result in a
yeah,
very difficult operating environment, something similar to what you have in Nigeria's Port Harcourt in the Niger Delta, where for many years
mm,
it has been considered a difficult operating environment for oil companies. However, oil majors are all still invested there, despite the environmental degradation, despite the security threat that exists. And they have a partial solution that still creates economic returns despite the conflict. And I don't think that in the case of Total in Mozambique, that was what they were willing to accept as a future of the project. So
yeah,
I think that's why they've eventually decided to call a force majeure on the project.
yeah. Okay. Do you have any other story on Africa?
Yes, the
Any more
next
stories?
story is SADC Extraordinary Troika Summit has been postponed. SADC leaders agreed to postpone the Extraordinary Troika Summit, which was scheduled for the 29th of April. The meeting was postponed because the SADC organ chairperson, His Excellency President Mokgweetsi Eric Kiabetswe Masisi, President of Botswana, is currently in quarantine. The meeting was expected to receive a report from the technical assessment team that was deployed in Mozambique following the decisions of the SADC Extraordinary Troika Summit held on the 8th of April this month. But that is no longer taking place.
One gets the feeling that there is little urgency here as far as SADC is concerned. I mean, in Mozambique, it is said there's about almost 1 million internally displaced people. Now, regional integration does not seem to be very high on SADC's agenda, at least not when one compares this to the East African community we talked about, or ECOWAS in West Africa. Your thoughts on that, Sia?
I do think that the SADC region is facing a bit of an existential crisis. I think one being that it's hit a plateau in terms of its intra-regional trade levels, which have grown from about 15% to about 20% of total trade in the region. So that, coupled with the slow growth in South Africa, because South Africa accounted for about 40 to 50% of the regional GDP. And so without the growth, without deepening further integration process, we've seen a rise in conflict and a rise in instability, I think, caused by the economic difficulties and economic challenges in the region. Hence, you've seen the significant issue of migration, which has led to tensions and competition in some of the nodes in the region, leading to xenophobic violence, etc. As well as now, as we've seen, the insurgents in northern Cabo Delgado trying to disrupt what could be a mega project that would reignite the region. So I would say that it's the slow process of the integration on the economic side, which has created a difficult operating environment and created an environment where we've got sort of negative outcomes, which are now destabilizing and even putting to threat a further continuance or even a recovery on the side of the economic activity and economic integration process in SADC. But these aren't new challenges. These are challenges that the whole continent has faced at different times. For example, Central and East Africa had its period of conflict and famines, etc., and moved beyond this. And although they've not dealt decisively with the problem of regional conflict, they have made significant progress in terms of economic integration as well as economic transformation of the living conditions amongst East Africans as well as the wealth in the region. Similarly, there was a strong growth period in West Africa driven by commodity boom from the mid 2000s all the way up until 2014, and the commodity price collapse led to economic decline, and that also coupled with insurgency domestically in some of the big economies, such as the Boko Haram issue in Nigeria, which is also now spread into a regional conflict into neighboring countries such as Cameroon, Chad, etc. And I think what we're seeing is that the slowing of the integration process has created an environment where we've got political challenges which are now undermining that economic growth. Because always the prerequisite for economic growth and activity is always going to be peace and stability. And so the minute that is disrupted, we now are set on a different path that won't recover from the slow economic activity. So I think with that said, that ends the stories from the rest of Africa this week. And that brings an end to our show.
It was a nice one. Thank you. Yeah.